"This is Miss Trotwood's," said the young woman. "Now you know, and that's all I have got to say." With which words she hurried into the house, as if to shake off the responsibility of my appearance, and left me standing at the garden gate, looking disconsolately over the top of it towards the parlour window, where a muslin curtain partly undrawn in the middle, a large round green screen or fan fastened onto the window-sill, a small table, and a great chair suggested to me that my aunt might be at that moment seated in an awful state. My shoes were by this time in a woeful condition. The soles had shed themselves bit by bit, and the upper leathers had broken and burst until the very shape and form of shoes had departed from them. My hat, which had served me for a nightcap too, was so crushed and bent that no old battered handleless saucepan on a dunghill need have been ashamed to vie with it. My shirt and trousers, stained with heat, dew, grass, and the Kentish soil on which I had slept, and torn besides, might have frightened the birds from my aunt's on brush since I left London. Since my aunt might have frightened the birds from my aunt's garden as I stood at the gate. My hair had known no comb or brush since I left London. My face, neck, and hands, from unaccustomed exposure to the air and sun, were burnt to a berry brown. From head to foot, I was powdered almost as white with chalk and dust, as if I had come out of a lime kiln. In this plight, and with a strong consciousness of it, I waited to introduce myself to and make my first impression on my formidable aunt. The unbroken stillness of the parlour window leading me to infer, after a while, that she was not there, I lifted up my eyes to the window above it, where I saw a florid, pleasant-looking gentleman with a grey head, who shut up one eye in a grotesque manner, nodded his head at me several times, shook it at me as often, laughed, and went away. I had been discomposed enough before, but I was so much the more discomposed by this unexpected behaviour that I was on the point of slinking off to think how I had best proceed, when there came out of the house a lady with her handkerchief tied over her cap and a pair of gardening gloves on her hands, wearing a gardening pocket like a tollman's apron, and carrying a great knife. I knew her immediately to be Miss Betsy, for she came stalking out of the house exactly as my poor mother had so often described her stalking up our garden at Blunderstone Rookery. "Go away," said Miss Betsy, shaking her head and making a distant chop in the air with her knife. "Go along. No boys here." I watched her, with my heart at my lips, as she marched to a corner of her garden and stooped to dig up some little root there. Then, without a scrap of courage, but with a great deal of desperation, I went softly in and stood beside her, touching her with my finger. "If you please, ma'am," I began. She started and looked up. "If you please, aunt." "Eh?" exclaimed Miss Betsy, in a tone of amazement I have never heard approached. "If you please, aunt, I am your nephew." "Oh, Lord!" said my aunt, and sat flat down in the garden path. "I am David Copperfield of Blunderstone in Suffolk, where you came on the night when I was born, and saw my dear mamma. I have been very unhappy since she died. I have been slighted, and taught nothing, and thrown upon myself, and put to work not fit for me. It made me run away to you. I was robbed at first setting out, and have walked all the way, and have never slept in a bed since I began the journey." Here my self-support gave way all at once, and with a movement of my hands, intended to show her my ragged state, and call it to witness that I had suffered something, I broke into a passion of crying, which I suppose had been pent up within me all the week. My aunt, with every sort of expression but wonder discharged from her countenance, sat on the gravel, staring at me, until I began to cry, when she got up in a great hurry, collared me, and took me into the parlour. Her first proceeding there was to unlock a tall press, bring out several bottles, and pour some of the contents of each into my mouth. I think they must have been taken out at random, for I am sure I tasted aniseed water, anchovy sauce, and salad dressing. When she had administered these restoratives, as I was still quite hysterical and unable to control my sobs, she put me on the sofa with a shawl under my head and a handkerchief from her own head under my feet, lest I should sully the cover. And then, sitting herself down behind the green fan or screen I have already mentioned, so that I could not see her face, ejaculated at intervals, "Mercy on us!" letting those exclamations off like minute guns. After a time she rang the bell. "Janet," said my aunt, when her servant came in, "go upstairs, give my compliments to Mr. Dick, and say I wish to speak to him." Janet looked a little surprised to see me lying stiffly on the sofa. I was afraid to move lest it should be displeasing to my aunt, but went on her errand. My aunt, with her hands behind her, walked up and down the room until the gentleman who had squinted at me from the upper window came in laughing. "Mr. Dick," said my aunt, "don't be a fool, because nobody can be more discreet than you can when you choose. We all know that. So don't be a fool, whatever you are." The gentleman was serious immediately, and looked at me, I thought, as if he would entreat me to say nothing about the window. "Mr. Dick," said my aunt, "you have heard me mention David Copperfield? Now don't pretend you not to have a memory, because you and I know better." "David Copperfield?" said Mr. Dick, who did not appear to me to remember much about it. "David Copperfield? Oh, yes, to be sure. David, certainly." "Well," said my aunt, "this is his boy, his son. He would be as like his father as is possible to be, if he was not so like his mother too." "His son?" said Mr. Dick. "David's son, indeed." "Yes," pursued my aunt, "and he has done a pretty piece of business. He has run away. Ah, his sister, Betsy Trotwood, never would have run away." My aunt shook her head firmly, confident in the character and behavior of the girl who was never born. "Oh, you think she wouldn't have run away?" said Mr. Dick. "Bless and save the man!" exclaimed my aunt sharply. "How he talks! Don't I know she wouldn't? She would have lived with her godmother, and we should have Betsy Trotwood have run from or to." "Nowhere," said Mr. Dick. "Well then," returned my aunt, softened by the reply, "how can you pretend to be wool-gathering, Dick, when you are as sharp as a surgeon's lancet? Now, here you see young David Copperfield, and the question I put to you is, what shall I do with him?" "What shall you do with him?" said Mr. Dick feebly, scratching his head. "Oh, do with him? Yes," said my aunt, with a grave look in her forehead. "Come, advice." "Why, if I was you," said Mr. Dick, considering and looking vacantly at me, "I should—" The contemplation of me seemed to inspire him with a sudden idea, and he added briskly, "I should wash him." "Janet," said my aunt, turning round with a quiet triumph which I did not then understand, "Mr. Dick sets it all right." Interested in this dialogue, I could not help observing my aunt, Mr. Dick, and Janet while it was in progress, and completing a survey I had already been engaged in making of the room. My aunt was a tall, hard-featured lady, but by no means ill-looking. There was an inflexibility in her face, in her voice, in her gait and carriage, amply sufficient to account for the effect she had made upon a gentle creature like my mother. But her features were rather handsome than otherwise, though unbending and austere. I particularly noticed that she had a very quick, bright eye. Her hair, which was grey, was arranged in two plain divisions, under which I believe would be called a mob cap. I mean a cap much more common then than now, with side pieces fastening under the chin. Her dress was of a lavender colour, and perfectly neat. but scantily made as if she desired to be as little encumbered as possible. I remember that I thought it more like a riding habit with a superfluous skirt cut off than anything else. She wore at her side a gentleman's gold watch, if I might judge from its size and make, with an appropriate chain and seals. She had some linen at her throat, not unlike a shirt collar, and things at her wrists like little shirt wristbands. Mr. Dick, as I have already said, was grey-headed and florid. I should have said all about him in saying so, had not his head been curiously bowed, not by age. It reminded me of one of Mr. Creakle's boys' heads after a beating, and his grey eyes, prominent and large, with a strange kind of watery brightness in them that made me, in combination with his vacant manner, his submission to my aunt, and his childish delight when she praised him, suspect him of being a little mad. Though, if he were mad, how he came to be there puzzled me extremely. He was dressed like any other ordinary gentleman, in a loose grey morning coat and waistcoat and white trousers, and had his watch in his fob and his money in his pockets, which he rattled as if he were very proud of it. Janet was a pretty blooming girl of about 19 or 20, and a perfect picture of neatness. Though I made no further observation of her at the moment, I may mention here what I did not discover until afterwards, namely, that she was one of a series of protégés whom my aunt had taken into her service expressly to educate in a renouncement of mankind, and who had generally completed their abjuration by marrying the baker. The room was as neat as Janet or my aunt. As I laid down my pen a moment since, to think of it, the air from the sea came blowing in again, mixed with the perfume of the flowers, and I saw the old-fashioned furniture, and polished, my aunt's inviolable chair and table by the round green fan in the bow window, the drugget-covered carpet, the cat, the kettle holder, the two canaries, the old china, the punch bowl full of dried rose leaves, the tall press guarding all sorts of bottles and pots, and wonderfully out of keeping with the rest, my dusty self upon the sofa, taking note of everything. Janet had gone away to get the bath ready, when my aunt, to my great alarm, became in one moment rigid with indignation, and had hardly voice to cry out, "Janet! Donkeys!" Upon which Janet came running up the stairs as if the house were in flames, darted out on a little piece of green in front, and to set hoof upon it, while my aunt, rushing out of the house, seized the bridle of a third animal laden with a bestriding child, turned him, led him forth from those sacred precincts, and boxed the ears of the unlucky urchin in attendance who had dared to profane that hallowed ground. To this hour, I don't know whether my aunt had any lawful right of way over that patch of green, but she had settled it in her own mind that she had, and it was all the same to her. The one great outrage of her life, demanding to be constantly avenged, was the passage of a donkey over that immaculate spot. In whatever occupation she was engaged, however interesting to her the conversation in which she was taking part, a donkey turned the current of her ideas in a moment, and she was upon him straight. Jugs of water, sticks were laid in ambush behind the door, sallies were made at all hours, and incessant war prevailed. Perhaps this was an agreeable excitement to the donkey boys, or perhaps the more sagacious of the donkeys, understanding how the case stood, there were 3 alarms before the bath was ready, and that on the occasion of the last and most desperate of all, I saw my aunt engage, single-handed, with a sandy-headed lad of 15, and bump his sandy head against her own gate before he seemed to comprehend what was the matter. These interruptions were the more ridiculous to me, because having firmly persuaded herself that I was actually starving and must receive nourishment at first in very small quantities, and while my mouth was yet open to receive the spoon, she would put in back into the basin and cry, "Janet, donkeys!" and go out to the assault. The bath was a great comfort, for I began to be sensible of acute pains in my limbs from lying out in the fields, and was now so tired and low that I could hardly keep myself awake for 5 minutes together. When I had bathed, I mean my aunt and Janet, enrobed me in a shirt and a pair of trousers belonging to Mr. Dick, and tied me up in 2 or 3 great shawls. What sort of bundle I looked like, I don't know, but I felt a very hot one. Feeling also very faint and drowsy, I soon lay down on the sofa again and fell asleep. It might have been a dream originating in the fancy which had occupied my mind so long, but I awoke with the impression that my aunt had come and bent over me and had put my hair away from my face and laid my head more comfortably and had then stood looking at me. The words "pretty fellow" or "poor fellow" seemed to be in my ears too, but suddenly there was nothing else when I awoke to lead me to believe that they had been uttered by my aunt, who stood in the bow window, gazing at the sea from behind the green fan, which was mounted on a kind of swivel and turned anyway. We dined soon after I woke, off a roast fowl and a pudding. I sat at table, not unlike a trusted bird myself, and moving my arms with considerable difficulty, but as my aunt had swathed me up, I made no complaint of being inconvenienced. All this time I was deeply anxious to know what she was going to do with me, but she took her dinner in profound silence, except when she occasionally fixed her eyes on me sitting opposite and said, "Mercy upon us!" which did not by any means relieve my anxiety. The cloth being drawn, and some sherry put upon the table, of which I had a glass, my aunt sent up for Mr. Dick again, who joined us, and looked as wise as he could when she requested him to attend to my story, which she elicited from me gradually by a course of questions. During my recital, she kept her eyes on Mr. Dick, who I thought would have gone to sleep but for that, and who, whensoever he lapsed into a smile, was checked by a frown from my aunt. "Whatever possessed that poor unfortunate baby, that she must go and be married again," said my aunt, when I had finished, "I can't conceive. Perhaps she fell in love with her second husband," Mr. Dick suggested. "Fell in love?" repeated my aunt. "What do you mean? What business had she to do it?" "Perhaps," Mr. Dick simpered, after thinking a little, "she did it for pleasure." "Pleasure, indeed," replied my aunt. "A mighty pleasure for the poor baby to fix her simple faith upon any dog of a fellow certain to ill use her in some way or other. What did she propose to herself, I should like to know? She had had one husband. She had seen David Copperfield out of the world, who was always running after wax dolls from his cradle. She had got a baby. Oh, there were a pair of babies when she gave birth to this child sitting here that Friday night. And what more did she want?" Mr. Dick secretly shook his head at me, as if he thought there was no getting over this. "She couldn't even have a baby like anybody else," said my aunt. "Where was this child's sister, Betsy Trotwood? Not forthcoming, don't tell me." Mr. Dick seemed quite frightened. "That little man of a doctor, with his head on one side," said my aunt. "Jellips, or whatever his name was. What was he about? All he could do was say to me, like a Robin Redbreast as he is, 'It's a boy, a boy.' Yah! The imbecility of the whole set of 'em." The heartiness of the ejaculation startled Mr. Dick exceedingly, and me too, if I am to tell the truth. And then, as if this was not enough, and she had not stood sufficiently in the light of this child's sister, Betsy Trotwood, said my aunt, "she marries a second time, goes and marries a murderer, or a man with a name like it, and stands in this child's light. And the natural consequence is, as anybody but a baby might have foreseen, that he prowls and wanders. He's as like Cain before he was grown up as he can be. Mr. Dick looked hard at me as if to identify me in this character. And then there's that woman with the pagan name, said my aunt. That Peggotty. She goes and gets married next, because she has not seen enough of the evil attending such things. She goes and gets married next, as the child relates. I only hope, said my aunt, shaking her head, that her husband is one of those poker husbands who abound in the newspapers and will beat her well with one. I could not bear to hear my old nurse so derided, so decried, and made the subject of such a wish. I told my aunt that indeed she was mistaken, that Peggotty was the best, the truest, the most faithful, most devoted, and most self-denying friend and servant in the world, who had ever loved me dearly, who had ever loved my mother dearly, who had held my mother's dying head upon her arm, and on whose face my mother had imprinted her last graceful, grateful kiss. And my remembrance of them both choking me, I broke down as I was trying to say that her home was my home, and that all she had was mine, and that I would have gone to her for shelter but for her humble station, which made me fear that I might bring some trouble on her. I broke down, I say, as I were as I was trying to say so, and laid my face in my hands upon the table. Well, well, said my aunt, the child is right to stand by those who have stood by him. Janet, donkeys! I thoroughly believe that but for those unfortunate donkeys, we should have come to a good understanding, for my aunt had laid her hand on my shoulder, and the impulse was upon me, thus emboldened, to embrace her and beseech her protection. But the interruption, and the disorder she was thrown into by the struggle outside, put an end to all softer ideas for the present, and kept my aunt indignantly declaiming to Mr. Dick about her determination to appeal for redress to the laws of her country, and to bring actions for trespass against the whole donkey proprietorship of Dover until tea time. After tea, we sat at the window on the lookout, as I imagined from my aunt's sharp expression of face, for more invaders until dusk, when Janet set candles and a backgammon board on the table and pulled down the blinds. Now, Mr. Dick, said my aunt, with her grave look and her forefinger up as before, I am going to ask you another question. Look at this child. David's son? Said Mr. Dick, with an attentive, puzzled face. Exactly so, returned my aunt. What would you do with him now? Do with David's son? Said Mr. Dick. Aye, replied my aunt, with David's son. Oh, said Mr. Dick, yes, do with. I should put him to bed. Janet, cried my aunt, with the same complacent triumph that I had remarked before. Mr. Dick sets us all right. If the bed is ready, we'll take him up to it. Janet, reporting it to be quite ready, I was taken up to it kindly, but in some sort like a prisoner, my aunt going in front and Janet bringing up the rear. The only circumstance which gave me any new hope was my aunt stopping on the stairs to inquire about a smell of fire that was prevalent there, and Janet's replying that she had been making tinder down in the kitchen of my old shirt. But there were no other clothes in my room than the odd heap of things I wore, and when I was left there, with a little taper which my aunt forewarned me would burn exactly 5 minutes, I heard them lock my door on the outside. Turning these things over in my mind, I deemed it possible that my aunt, who could know nothing of me, might suspect I had a habit of running away, and took precautions on that account to have me in safe keeping. The room was a pleasant one at the top of the house, overlooking the sea, on which the moon was shining brilliantly. After I had said my prayers and the candle had burnt out, I remember how I still sat looking at the moonlight on the water, as if I could hope to read my fortune in it, as in a bright book, or to see my mother with her child coming from heaven along that shining path, to look upon me as she had looked when I last saw her sweet face. I remember how the solemn feeling with which at length I turned my eyes away yielded to the sensation of gratitude and rest which the sight of the white curtained bed, and how much more the lying softly down upon it, nestling in the snow-white sheets, inspired. I remember how I thought of all the solitary places under the night sky where I had slept, and how I prayed that I never might be houseless any more, and never might forget the houseless. I remember how I seemed to float then down the melancholy glory of that track upon the sea, away into the world of dreams.